remember, again, as always, if you have questions, comments, issues, disagreements, gripes, just drop those here in the chat button there. Always happy to hear from you. Of course, this synchronicity is, of course, the advantage to this. But again, you can always watch afterwards online. And now I'm going to present let's try presenting a window today. Will that work? No, I don't think that'll work. Okay, so I'll present my entire screen. And again, like I said, we're talking more about institutions today, and with the focus on education as an institution. And I think, I mentioned last time, kind of the way we're thinking about this is a bit as, from a structural functionalist perspective, thinking about these different institutions, not just in terms of the problems internal to the institutions, although we want to focus on that to some extent, but talking about how, because different institutions serve needs, fulfill needs in other parts of society or to other structures in society, talk about the different problems that either we could say that the educational institution causes, or that it is related to. Sorry, I just looked over and I was left a bottle of Virex. Virex. It kills everything. Okay, that's cool. I'll carry that with me from now on. All right, sorry. Okay, so education as an institution. What are the problems in education? But certainly, what are the problems that the educational system poses for the rest of society? And we should say, well, I'll give you the basic definitions here as always. But remember, a lot of the point with especially the institution of education is that we think that it fulfills this need, potentially for upward mobility, right? So we say, what's education? It transmits knowledge to people, and that's facts. But importantly, that's job skills as well. That's ideas, that's skills, that's things you can apply. And in the hope in America, as a putatively egalitarian society, is that education would be, I don't want to say the great leveler necessarily, but something that can really equalize the opportunities for different kinds of students. The archetypal idea, is the poor person who gets a good education can pull himself up by his bootstraps and be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company or something like that. Of course, though, and we'll talk in some detail about this in a moment. Of course, that doesn't exactly work out, right? And so we talk about significant inequalities in the educational system as being a problem. But if everything was running smoothly, or maybe running in the way that we wished it would, then everybody would get a first-rate education. Okay. In addition, I should point out, in addition to those, basics, education also transmits cultural norms, what it means to be an American, or values, right? So, the thing I point out often is, that thing that we do every morning for the first 13 years of most of our education. I know there's a few places that don't do this, but pledging our allegiance to the flag, right? So school makes you a bit of a patriot, whether you want to or not. I guess is the point there, right? They're really trying to instill that pro-American nationalist value into you. Should also point out, though, that's not, education is not just something that happens in school. We'll talk a bit about that, but of course the focus usually is on schools, actually, arguably to the detriment of our better public policy options. Okay, so just a little bit of a global perspective here. Today, our focus is really going to be on schooling in American society. But we should think about, in global terms, and also, potentially somewhat, in terms of the history of Western societies. We think of education as a really important thing because it's necessary to, first and foremost, literacy. So getting out of the fields, getting out of pure manual labor kind of work, requires literacy, requires your ability both to read and write, but also we talk about mathematical literacy as well here, right? So you have to be able to do those things, at an individual level. Of course, in order for a person to have a better kind of job and better life opportunities, you have to gain, the skills that you need to compete in a global workforce. But then at the level of nations, it is necessary for economic success, right? In order to have a 21st century workforce, you have to have a reasonably well-educated populace, and that really is something that sets the developed nations apart from the less developed nations at this point, is the degree to which they have these literate, skilled workforces. But of course, it's expensive to do that. It's expensive to send kids to public schools, to pay the teachers, to pay for the facilities, of course. And we notice, especially in developing nations, there are significant gender disparities in terms of education. So boys tend to get considerably more education in those developing countries, and to the extent that even in some places, like in Afghanistan when they were under the Taliban, girls are not allowed to go to school. But even where they are technically allowed to, there are disparities in the amount of girls that families are sending to school. They tend to focus more on educating the boys. And finally, just in this global perspective, we would want to note that that schooling impacts public health. Better educated people are more likely to take better care of themselves, to know the kind of even just basic things like hand washing that are needed for a healthy populace and to prevent infectious diseases. I'm trying to think. This was in the news again, recently. Of course, we talk about hand washing, and I think it was it was one of these nations. Maybe it was Liberia, where they had the Ebola outbreak a few years ago, and now they're kind of preparing for. They're not quite in the coronavirus outbreak yet, but they're trying to prevent it from getting bad. And something that public health advocates really were focused on is people literally just don't don't wash their hands, don't know how to wash their hands, don't know the value of something really that seems simple to us, like washing your hands. And those are the kinds of things that an effective school system can transmit to people. Okay, where are you? There, are you with me? You're with me, okay, and yes, it is gross to think that, yes, people are not washing their hands, and of course all the other stuff too that goes along with effective health, from eating habits to exercise and all that. We do spend a lot of time teaching that in our schools. All right, so yeah, a little bit. Yeah, this is really kind of more in the focus on the U.S. now. Globally speaking, though, in comparison to other places, we're not doing super great. So we're talking about 17% of Americans as being functionally illiterate, meaning that they don't know how to. Sorry, I had a visitor again. They don't know, enough to sort of read instructions, on a tax bill or something like that. It also, the measure of functional literacy, like I mentioned, also includes mathematical literacy. And this is a bit of an old number, and we really don't track this very frequently. So this could be somewhat out of date. I think this is from about 2007 or so, when they last did a fairly comprehensive study of literacy in America. But that found, 17% of Americans are functionally illiterate. That is a higher rate than many Western European countries, but certainly a lower rate than developing countries in general. And yeah, the point in here, the basic point, is that high income countries like our own tend to have large schooling disparities. That means there's a great difference between the number of years of schooling between people in the society, and of course the quality of the schooling. And so just as a very rough first pass here, we'll say poor people tend to be more poorly educated in general. Rich people tend to be better educated, and we start to see that in terms of things like graduation rates. Certainly one of the success stories in American society over the last century and a half has been the number of people who graduate from high school, right? So roughly 90% of American students graduate from high school now. Although you can see that's sort of leveling off. It'll be interesting to watch, in the next 10, 20 years or so, if that kind of continues up. But as you kind of see this, I know you've heard a lot about flattening the curve. Here's another curve that appears to be flattening. So we may reach a sort of a societal maximum of around 92% of people graduating from high school. There's always going to be, well, I don't know, that's a little pessimistic, but one might say there's always going to be some proportion of students who do not graduate high school for one reason or another. Although I should note, part of the leveling that we see here is tied to immigrants, right? So immigrant kids are a little less likely to graduate for a variety of reasons, right? Language being important amongst those. So we see, that's kind of a great equalizer. Many more people, a large proportion of the society, do graduate from high school now. The real separator here, the real distinguisher. Is that a good word? Not a great word. We'll use it. The distinguisher here, between populations within America, is whether you graduate from college. And of course, as somebody who's involved in higher education, this number still surprises me. Less than 40% of Americans are college graduates. Of course, I look around, and in my social milieu, and maybe that's kind of an important point about educational disparities, right? I've kind of carried myself into a social milieu where everybody seems to be a college graduate. Of course, that's very much not true. That's only about a third of the country. And of course, you go to certain places, you spend time with certain populations, and the college graduation rates are much lower, right? And that really is a distinguisher in our society, especially because the college degree is largely considered the pathway to success, right? The pathway to good jobs. It's not a guarantee that you'll get a good job if you're a college graduate, but your chances of getting a good job are much lower if you are not a college graduate. So I've kind of alluded to this before. Globally, America is a bit of an underperformer. So if we look at OECD nations, so other developed nations, look at our test scores on especially math and language use. So they have these kind of standardized tests to compare math and language skills across countries. And we fall at about 25th place, which is, I guess if you are amongst those who think that America is the greatest nation ever, this is sort of evidence that belies that idea. An important thing to note there, however, is that there are these large disparities among or between populations within the United States. So there are certainly large groups of American students who go to really good schools, who perform really well on those tests, and I think we can safely say that, you can put America's best students up against the best students from the rest of the world, and American students, perform at those top levels. But it's a disparity here where there's large groups who are not performing at competitive leves in global comparison, right? So again, poor kids going to poor schools, tend to be pulling this average down. And of course, those kids are suffering for that lack, I guess, of education. It's worth pointing out that SAT performance is declining in the U.S. So people's scores are trending downwards. But an important thing to note there is that more people are taking it. Although this is a funny funny thing. Again, coronavirus will change so many things. We just voted the other day as a college that we're not going to require test scores for a couple of years now because the coronavirus has prevented high school juniors from taking that all-important spring SAT or ACT. So this could be becoming, well, certainly at this point that more people take it. That's out the window for this year. And if many institutions go the way of Eckerd College, and we're kind of following the pack here. Lots of institutions have decided not to require SATs and or ACTs, and again, it's going to be for a few years for us, a few years at a lot of these institutions. That may mean the SAT as an institution is dying, and that is so some people really see that as a good thing, because there are some pretty systematic differences between the SAT scores of people in different minority groups, as well as, of course, people living in poverty. So, we see, this is the math SAT scores. If you look at the dark blue line, those are scores of African Americans, and they tend to score, much lower than, Asians especially, right? These gray lines are Asians, or whites, right? So whites kind of form the we call normal curve, normal distribution in the middle here, and so we talk about that as a compounded disparity between these groups. Checking, nothing in the chat. Okay, I'm assuming that means everything's going well for you. All right, here's, I think, a point we can't emphasize enough, is that home is key to education. There's a line in your book, I forget what the number is exactly, but the number of hours that kids spend in school a week, and especially if you think about like waking hours, you spend about 6 hours in school per day. That means you spend about twice as much time in your home. And we really know that it is the kind of activities that you do in your home, the kind of values and practices that your parents emphasize, that are really the great predictors of success in education. And so again, I put this in the framework of compounded inequality. This means that, as much as we would like for educational institutions, for public schools in particular, to be these kind of great levelers, to give more opportunities to poorer students or minority students, we know that really the difference comes from families. And that's, I think, only now, I guess it kind of comes and goes in the policy sphere, but it hasn't been on the policy agenda significantly for almost 50 years, really. The question here is really, how would you craft public policy in such a way as to overcome these disparities in the home? What can be done outside of formally schooling children that might give especially poorer kids and minority kids more of a leg up? And really the policy debate tends to focus around, what can we do to our schools to make them better? But the best social science for years, has known that it's really not, the schools can only have a very limited effect on educational outcomes. Educational outcomes are really tied to the home. James Heckman is an economist who really puts a pretty fine point on it, that it's generally stuff that happens even before school, even before formal schooling, that really has the most important effects on someone's lifetime educational potential. And so Heckman's point is that the most important education, happens from newborn to about age 3, and those are things like having books in the home, having parents who don't have to put their kids in daycare but spend a lot of time, talking to their children. Having appropriate kinds of toys in the home, not letting kids watch too much television or engage too much with screen time. Right? That's just incredibly important for brain development. Like I say, Heckman's a sociologist, or I'm sorry, an economist, and he's shown this with large scale social surveys, and this is evidence that's borne out by cognitive research, by things like fMRI research that actually shows that brain development, brain growth tends to be much more pronounced in these kind of better off families with more enriching environments in infancy. And that, by age 3, the brains of kids who live in households without as many books, without as much literacy, are significantly different looking. And so really the policy challenge is how do you get to these kids? How do you make impacts in the home? And again, that's not something that public policy generally has been very focused on, although there is some talk about expanding Head Start, which is this early education program. Okay, so that's all very long-winded, but I really do want you to know that takeaway, that it's not really schools that make the difference. It is the home. That's not to say that schools can't make a difference, don't make some difference, and certainly, obviously, in certain kids' lives, they make a huge difference. But really, in the aggregate, the disparities about educational outcomes are mostly about the home and family. Mentioned briefly dropouts. Dropping out was, in the 80s, 90s, a sort of a public policy focus. It's much less of a public policy focus nowadays because you see just how low dropout rates really have become. So, for most groups, we're talking about significantly less than 10% of students drop out of school. And that is partly tied certainly to finances. And so some kids are dropping out of school in order to go into paid work, by the time they're around 16 or so. So in some poor families, that labor is necessary. And partly, though, you can see this is, again, predicated on ethnicity. So, and especially here for Hispanics and Native Americans, it's interesting now Native Americans have the highest dropout rates amongst all the ethnicities we're considering here. Partly that is tied to, sort of a pretty bad legacy of American governmental institutions and how they treat Native Americans. And so there is a sort of a negative image of the schools, of government schools amongst Native Americans. And like I mentioned with Hispanics, some portion of these kids are either immigrants or the children of immigrants, and we know, especially based on language disparities, they're dropping out in higher numbers. The problem, the point about that, somewhat, with any of these kids who are dropping out, or many of these kids anyway, this goes again to that idea of the cycle of poverty that I think I've mentioned before. This idea that the kids who are more likely to drop out are more likely to come from poor families, and of course, if you drop out, you're much less likely to not be poor, right? You're much more likely to be poor in the future, and so these are the children of poor parents who then go on to become poor parents themselves, and across generations, we have these families that are locked into these low income, low education situations. Where are you? You're over here. Okay. Still looking good. Still hanging out. Well, at least 17 of you are here. So that's something. Okay. Race and ethnic segregation, has been and continues to be a problem. I just noticed this. Why is there a pot there? I don't know. It's a big old pot, right? So this is, I want to say Montgomery, Alabama in 1956, 7. This is, oh no, sorry, Little Rock, Arkansas. This is, they had to bring in the National Guard. President Eisenhower had to order the National Guard to escort the 5 students here. You can see the African American students here. Eisenhower had to order the National Guard to escort them into the school in Little Rock, Arkansas, because the governor was a racist and believed in racism and did not want to let African American students into these all-white high schools. And that became illegal in 1954 since the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So school integration began, and legally, you can't keep a public school, all white anymore. But of course, in fact, schools are still very segregated. So during the 1960s through the early 90s, we tried busing, where you would bus kids from majority African American neighborhoods to majority white neighborhoods to go to school there, and vice versa, in order to integrate the schools. That was ordered by the courts in many municipalities, but that largely failed, in part because in places that did that, the white people just left. For example, in Detroit, the white Detroit residents just left town and moved to the suburbs because they were racists and they didn't want their kids going to school with black kids. And that happened in towns like Boston and Chicago as well. So that's what we call white flight. That undermines the ability of busing to do anything about structural segregation in schools, and so the courts basically gave up in the 90s. They said that you don't have to do busing anymore, and the bottom line is that schools are just about as segregated now as they were in the 1960s. And of course, again, the point of that, the problem of that is that schools that are majority minority, or almost all minority students, are more likely to be poor schools, and really can't offer the same educational opportunities as better off schools. And we know there are some really, again, even within public schooling, really significant disparities between the quality of the facilities, the quality of the teachers in these different schools. And so that is really, still a concern. I should mention, though, that some demographers are a little more optimistic about this. So I think it's I want to say Reynolds Farley, but I might be wrong about that. In Detroit, has been looking at these trends for years, and there are some findings now that suburban areas are becoming somewhat more integrated finally, and of course that means that more minority students will have access to those better schools. But that's a very slow process, and not a very widespread process quite yet. And a lot of that problem again comes down to this. It comes down to school funding, which I will say, is complicated. You could spend, probably a whole course learning about how schools are funded in different places, what that funding goes to, and so on. But again, in the aggregate, the kind of simplest story is that schools in poor places are more poorly funded than schools in richer places. Now, again, we're just talking about public schools here. Private schools obviously can tend to be very expensive, tend to have much higher per student funding than public schools. But really, the picture, I think, to learn, well, first of all, why is it important? The more you spend, the better books you can get, the better laptops, you can have a sports program, etc. You can hire better teachers, and therefore we do see some tie of per pupil spending to student learning outcomes like standardized test scores, college attendance rates, those sorts of things. The issue here is that the way that we fund schools is largely tied to property taxes. And what that means is that a place with more expensive homes and more active businesses will have higher property tax revenues and better schools. So this is just a kind of I don't know what you want to call it, a simulation. Let's call it a simulation of what this might look like in a state. So in general, most states have a sort of a minimal contribution to schools, or at least not a minimal contribution. The state pitches in a certain amount from state tax revenue up to a certain level of per pupil funding. So in this imaginary state here, the state requires that there's at least $6,000 in per pupil funding. And where they have really low blue lines here, those are the poorer districts where there's not much property tax coming in, and so the state makes up the difference. The real big disparities, though, come in these places that have much higher property tax revenue. And so kids in these districts, which tend to be, like, again, the richer districts, there's a lot of spending on those kids. And you can really see this, if you travel around different high schools, or if you bounced around different high schools when you were a student, that there are big differences between high schools. Where there are some high schools that have vibrant arts and music and sports programs, and on computer labs or laptops for every student, that sort of thing, as compared to schools that have 12, 20-year-old textbooks, no sports programs, no instruments for the kids, no enrichment programs, and so on and so forth. And again, the issue here is that those richer kids end up getting a better education, end up being rich adults who then move to rich neighborhoods and raise their own rich kids. Should point out, though, this is again a simulation, somewhat of a simplification. Again, the basic point is that property taxes determine how well off a school is. But there are certain, especially we see this in neighborhood schools in large urban areas. So, New York, Chicago, LA, those schools draw on the same property tax base, but in good neighborhoods, Parent involvement, fundraising, the PTA, donations from local businesses can make really important additions to the school budget. So you might have a rich dad who funds laptops or after school programs for the kids, and that's much more likely to happen in rich neighborhoods. So again, the bottom line, the picture is complicated, but as with so many things, the students of well-to-do people in well-to-do places tend to have better schooling experiences and better schooling outcomes. Finally, I should just mention part of what parents are contributing here is what we call cultural capital, and so there have been a number of studies that showed that I guess well-to-do middle-class people teach their kids behavior patterns that make schooling a more enriching experience for them. So, for example, this is like Annette LaRose research, where she talked to parents and kids, in poor areas and in richer areas, and she found that rich people teach their kids in part to question authority, but in part just to ask questions in general, to advocate for themselves. And so we know that those better off parents, generally speaking, are teaching kids to be basically better students, to ask those kind of questions, to clarify things so that they can get the most out of their education, whereas the tendency in poor and working class culture in America is to respect authority, which means not questioning and not advocating as much for yourself. Of course, that's talking in broad generalities, but that's the kind of cultural capital that we see. Cultural capital being sort of lessons about culture that rich parents give their kids that are very different from poor and working class parents, and that really does have a difference at the outcome level. This is just some just to show you kind of how this breaks down. Realistically, there are wide disparities. So I do want to say there are wide disparities at the school level. So between two different school districts. So I think about Chicago. The Chicago public schools have a reputation for many of them for not being very good. The facilities kind of run down. The textbooks a little out of date. You go up to the rich suburbs of Chicago, and it's a whole other story. But it works at a sort of higher level of aggregation as well. So if we look at the state level, you see that some states, Florida notably, right? Florida has pretty low per pupil spending of around $9,000 per student per year. And if you oppose that to California is at about 11,000. Connecticut is up to 19,000 almost. District of Columbia is over 19,000. Of course, to some extent, that reflects different costs of living. Everything is expensive in DC, but certainly this reflects different legislative priorities. And sort of typically, not across the board, but typically Republican-controlled legislatures tend to spend less on students. They want to tax people at lower rates, and Democratic-run legislatures tend to vote for more taxing and more spending on students. I will just point out, though, that the association between spending and outcomes is not perfect. So if we look, at at SAT scores, District of Columbia, where they were spending, what, 18,000 on students, that tends not to necessarily come out as a higher test score, right? So at the DC schools, students are scoring about 977. The Florida schools, actually for as low as we're spending on students, the students do pretty well. And again, the Connecticut, where they do spend a lot on students. We also have, this is kind of a funny chart because you got to look at participation rates as well. So it's like, it looks like Arkansas is pretty good here with an average score of 1169, but only 5% of their students take the SATs. So that's really, maybe that's really telling us the problem here, right? So Arkansas, where they only spend, right, a little less than 10,000 per student, they only get about 5% of their students to take the SATs. So again, not anything like a perfect correlation, but it really definitely suggests that that spending does have impacts on student outcomes. Other issues, I have a little bit of a problem, I guess, with saying that tracking is a problem. I guess we should say from some advocates' point of view, tracking is a problem. So what tracking is in general is this idea that different students in the same school will have different educational programs, and so I suspect, and if you were all here, I would be polling the class right now to say, how many of you remember breaking out into different reading groups, say in elementary school, and I mean, I assume you have some memory of this. If you just want to kind of mention in the chat, right? Like some of you were like the Eagles, and some of you were the Raccoons, and some of you were the Bears or something. And at 10 a.m., the Eagles would have their reading session while the Bears were off, quietly doing math homework in the corner. That's an early form of tracking that a lot of elementary schools really tend to do. And what that is about is, you have, by fifth grade or so, you have the fast readers who are, maybe they're reading novels, and the slow readers are still, reading Dick and Jane books. The teachers, trying to get them kind of, to some baseline level of literacy. Well, that's tracking. That's the idea that we're going to put the faster or the better educated students together so that they can learn at a more appropriate pace, and then we're going to put the students who have learned less, and in a slower paced situation. Again, though, and that continues, of course, past elementary school. You get the students who are on the track to go into calculus and math, and take physics classes, and then you get the tracks who barely get past home economics or something like that. The argument against doing this is that it tends to reward the already advantaged. So again, here's the idea of sort of cycles of poverty, vicious cycles. The kids who come into school with fewer advantages don't get more advantages from going to school. They're still held back because they don't get as high a quality of an education as these other kids. There are certainly people, though, who are sort of advocates of tracking, who still think that it's important, that we ought to challenge meet the students where they are, I guess you'd say. And we know that if you don't challenge the kids who have better educational backgrounds, they tend to become bored in school and really not perform as well as they could. The argument here, though, too, is that tracking may be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if if you take kids who maybe haven't had, again, we know home life is the most important thing. If you take those kids and you put them in the lower tracks, you're teaching them that they're not good enough or smart enough, and we may be really setting up this situation where the worst students just perform worse because they're told they're supposed to perform worse. You know that if you're reading a Dick and Jane reader, you're not supposed to be one of the smart kids, and so then you don't put in the effort in that we call it the self-fulfilling prophecy. The prophecy that you're not going to be smart fulfills itself because you've actually taught those kids not to work up to the level of their abilities. Okay, nobody puts their cameras on anymore. I see that you're there. I don't know. Are you really there? You just turn on the camera and go. Are you in the kitchen or something? Oh, there's one. Okay. Oh, there you are. Okay, good. People are here. Good. Okay, I'm going to take a drink of coffee. All right, and we're going to talk about gender inequality. And of course, we've talked a good deal about this earlier in the semester. This is really, I would say, a success story in schooling over the course of really the last 50, 60 years, that women have not only increased, become more equal to men, but have really surpassed men. And this is in post-secondary enrollment. So what that means is basically college enrollment, right? Although to some extent, vocational programs, associate programs, that sort of thing. But clearly, at this point, women have surpassed men in terms of that post-secondary enrollment. So whereas, after the Second World War, about 70% of college students were men, now it's actually down below 50%, right? So the 50% line was around 1980, and women have been creeping further and further away ever since. I would caution you, though, Eckerd is an especially disparate place where we're up to about a 70-30 split now, 70% women. Most schools are obviously not quite that strongly split, and this does speak to, differences between schools. So liberal arts schools do tend to be like Eckerd. The big state schools tend to be more towards 50-50. And what's that about? Partly that's about gendered teaching being on the decline across the 20th century. So it's not, not as common anymore for teachers to. And we had studies back in the 60s, 70s that really showed that teachers, in K-12, really taught to boys and girls in very different ways, right? Really didn't challenge girls as much, really, called on boys a lot more. That sort of thing has declined significantly. Should mention, though, big changes, big differences still remain in things like the choice of major and career path. Eckerd's a bit of an outlier in really pushing more STEM, more science, math, technology for women. A lot of schools, really have big disparities in those programs, especially in things like engineering, tend to be very male dominated still, and like nursing programs still tend to be dominated by women. But again, those differences linger, but they are declining slowly. I also want to point out here, especially with post-secondary education, right, with college and higher education, Title IX is responsible for a good deal of this change, since the early 70s. So Title IX, I know, we're all kind of familiar with it here in terms of its provisions about sexual assault and sexual harassment, but that's really just a sort of a small part of the broader picture of Title IX, which is more about, or more generally about, equality in educational access in general. So, per pupil spending should be, equal for men and women. And what actually, before sexual assault on campus really kind of became a policy focus, usually the context that I would encounter Title IX in was in sports spending. So schools have to spend equal amounts on men and women in sports. Sage asks, how do we, why has the gap reversed now, right? And that is interesting, and I really think it follows a bit from the different job pictures in part that we saw a few weeks back, right? So more of the male gendered work that's out there in society, and I'm thinking of things like pipe fitters and electricians and heavy equipment operators, right? More of those good paying jobs that are gender typed and that don't require a degree are male jobs. And so, other jobs, again, nursing would be a good example, that women do require a degree. So I think that's part of it, but there is kind of a broader argument that just culturally, I don't even quite know how to put it. Like culturally, men are kind of, not on the decline, but just not as encouraged to participate in education as they were, 30, 40 years ago.
I feel like I feel like men have more of the responsibility to start making an income earlier, if in a family dynamic, to begin to support the family, kind of going off traditional gendered roles. I feel like that there is still some presence of like the expectation that men start making an income while women focus on the family.
Yeah, and I think that's probably, it's more true in certain demographic groups too, right? So amongst like working class families, we do also see more of, and you're right, and think about in terms of people who would be starting a family around age 19 or 20, that tends to be more of a working class thing, right? And so that would tend to then be, right, those families that see the man as the breadwinner. Also, we see that in evangelicals a lot. So that kind of that traditional divide, and those more traditional families, would have a bit less of an emphasis on on college. Sorry. Okay, where are we at? So that's gender, and again, some of these lessons about gender from earlier in the semester. Also talking about immigration. I saw Sage had a question about migration waves, and that actually I really don't know, and I'm not sure that back in the earlier migration waves we kept good enough statistics to know what dropout rates were like 1960 or so. But certainly we know that that immigration, has issues, has caused issues for a number of schools, and especially we're especially talking about certain areas here. So this is a big deal, and really a hot button political issue in places like California, Arizona, Chicago, places where there are larger populations of immigrants. Not as much of an issue in, say, Michigan, right, where there are smaller immigrant populations. Of course, we emphasize school as a mobility mechanism, and this really is a big difference between what we call the first generation and either the 1.5 or the second generation. 1.5 are kids who immigrate when they are still children. So we call them the 1.5 because they're technically first generation immigrants, but a lot of their socialization, a lot of their experience is as Americans. Second generation are kids who are born in the U.S., and it really is a significant mobility mechanism. So whereas a lot of immigrants, especially from Central America, come here without a high school education, you saw the dropout rates are still higher than normal, but only to the tune of about 10%. So you're talking about 90% of Hispanic Americans are graduating from high school, and just having a high school education, the opportunities aren't as good as college education, but they're way better than not having a high school education. So schools are definitely important for immigrants. Kind of the political problems come up. Well, I mean, to some extent, the political problems come up for some people because they don't feel we should be spending money educating the children of so-called illegal immigrants. That's a kind of a radical minority view, I hope, at this point. But the more mainstream policy debate is over how to educate these kids, whether they should be in English immersion programs where they're taught in English throughout the school day and they just kind of have to learn as they go, versus bilingual education, where these kids, who come, especially who are coming from other countries and speak generally Spanish as a first language, will they get some education or most of their education in their native language, and then taking English as a second language classes alongside of that, so they build up the language skills. And again, this is a political issue, and some states have legislated that schools cannot provide bilingual education. They have to provide English-only education, that only language courses can be taught in foreign languages. That's the political side, but there is a pedagogical side here as well. The pedagogical side being that there's evidence kind of on both sides. There's evidence that suggests that English immersion has long-term benefits for students. There's also evidence that bilingual education, is a good way, especially in those non-language-based subjects, to get non-English speaking students the best education they can. So that is, it's not purely a political debate. Disability education. This is a real changing landscape, with the argument being that students with disabilities, and here we're talking about all kinds of disabilities, so physical disabilities, mental disabilities, mental illness, as well. The argument tends to be that those students should be what we call mainstreamed, put in classes with kids who don't have disabilities or have different or lower levels of disability. And really there's a legal framework around this as well, where it is mandated that the terminology is the least restrictive environment. I'm not sure restrictive is really the greatest word for it, but basically that students, regardless of their disabilities, or students with disabilities, should be put into regular classrooms as much as possible. Again, there's some pedagogical debate about that, though. It's like, if a kid is struggling with intellectual disabilities, is it really in that kid's best interest to be in a class with his or her peers who have less of a struggle? And so that's why we still maintain for especially the more severely disabled students these special education classes. You probably all remember or have heard of special ed, but again, really those are restricted to the kids with the more severe disabilities. And you probably remember, I'm assuming most of you have some experience of like a disabled student being in your classrooms, but with a helper or something along those lines, because again, really the mandating is that disabled students will be, as much as possible, in mainstream classrooms. Other issues, teacher shortages. We don't have enough teachers. We really argue, especially, we don't have enough good teachers, right? So, the unfortunate reality is that many of the people who would be really good teachers choose not to teach because teaching is not, in many places, a very well-paid profession. It's not pleasant work necessarily. Also, so when I talk about bureaucratic hurdles, teaching is sort of an unusually bureaucratized job. The states mandate that teachers, teach certain subjects. There's a lot less freedom over the kind of job that you can do compared to other things, right? So, if I just think about my situation, right, I get to teach more or less what I want to, and I like that. My brother is a state, public school teacher in New York, and he is constantly complaining about, well, they make me teach this, they make me teach that, they won't let me teach this book. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be in his shoes, right? And then at the worst, although this is easy to overstate, there are extreme places where there are violent kids. That does happen. There are a few schools. I mean, there are a few schools in St. Pete where that's at issue. That's not a problem for most teachers, but that's certainly, on the margins, discourages people from wanting to go into the teaching profession, or it's a profession with a high degree of burnout. And so some exposure to violent students may make teachers think it's not worth it and go off. And again, these are people with at least a bachelor's degree, in many cases a master's degree, and they can go off often and find better paid, more pleasant work. So violence, yes, there is violence in schools, of course. Partly that's predicated on the kind of population that we have, in our K-12 schools. So well, I don't know how your middle school and high school was, but we used to have fights once every couple of weeks or so, right? That's just how teenagers are to some extent. So when we talk about school violence, obviously a lot of the focus is on these mass shootings, and obviously those are horrible and very newsworthy. I guess the good story here is that really hasn't significantly increased, right? So I would focus more on the solid green line. We really haven't seen a huge spike in these school shootings, right? Deaths at schools, but this indicates that clearly there is a potential for violent death in schools, right? And that is a problem. And of course, schools do many different things to try to reduce that. Especially after the Stoneman Douglas shootings, now, in Florida, they have school resource officers with guns in every school. They've tried arming teachers in a lot of places. A lot of schools have metal detectors now. You experience, campus lockdowns and these kinds of things. Various things that really do take attention away from teaching in order to try to make schools safe places. I should note though that generally, again, mass shooting is sort of an extreme, but there's also just general violence, fighting, knifings, etc. in schools. It's worse in larger schools, and usually we're talking about urban school systems and large suburban schools. It's worse in schools, just as we know in general, there's more crime because of less opportunities in places where there are more poor and minority students. Of course, some of this, especially this has gotten a lot of news in Chicago. This is gang violence spilling over into the schools because kids are joining gangs when they're 13, 14, 15. And so some of that violence is street violence, sort of, called for by older people in the gangs. To some extent, zero tolerance policies have been successful. Zero tolerance policies are, when if a kid shows up to school with a knife, or if a kid gets in a fight, they are likely to be expelled from the school. Of course, that gets the students most likely to engage in violence right out of the school. There is some question, though, as to whether that's really fair and just for those students who get expelled, right? Clearly those are students who need some more attention, but now who have significantly worse educational opportunities. Just checking in here. Okay, everybody's still hanging with me. No chat. All right. Whoops. This right. This was just towards pointing out. So mass school shootings clearly have been a recent phenomenon, or have gotten worse recently. So you see 2012 was Virginia Tech, or 2007 was Virginia Tech, 2012 was Sandy Hook. This is the list of the worst school mass killings globally. I should note the top 5 are really horrible cases from places like Palestine, where students are killed during armed conflict. But what? Okay, we do see certainly, in recent history, especially I think still on a lot of our minds is the Stoneman Douglas high school shooting, but then also the Santa Fe, Texas shooting, where you're talking about 10, 20 students being killed at a time. Would also note though that this does it's kind of partly a feature of the long history of America as just a really violent place. So you still see in the top 25 school disasters, school killings, is an incident from 1764, where a bunch of Native Americans during a Native American war, well, a war between the Native Americans and the English, in 1764, they went into a school in Pennsylvania, the Enoch Brown School, and slaughtered 10 students and the teacher in this one-room schoolhouse. So it's a long history, and still the worst disaster in American school history was the Bath School disaster, where a disgruntled janitor, I guess by all accounts kind of just a lunatic, while he was the janitor in this school in Bath, Michigan, he distributed dynamite. He wired the entire school with explosives, and then one day when he was just especially disturbed, he blew up the school and killed 44 people. So, to some extent, America's just a violent place, and of course, schools, as one of the major institutions in our society, are not immune from that broader violence. Turning to theory, then, unless there are questions about violence. Okay, turning to theory, then where did it go? Here it is. So structural functionalism, again, it said, to some extent, just talking about schools as an institution separate from the rest of society is a bit of a structural functionalist way to think about things. But clearly, when we look at schools, we look at an institution that's fulfilling important needs for societies. They're teaching skills that are required for citizens of a modern society. It is to the extent that there is mobility in our society, we really do focus on schools, and we could argue that this is almost a pressure valve by saying, like, hey, everybody has an opportunity to get an education in America. If you are poor, then it's your own fault. You were given schools. If you didn't take full advantage of them, then it's your fault. We can kind of say that, and that provides a bit of a pressure valve, if you will. People aren't as disgruntled about their lot in life because they do believe they had some opportunity. Although certainly the critical perspective, as we've seen, is that opportunities in school are very different for different populations. As I mentioned at the beginning, schools instill common values. There's a lot of emphasis recently, again, on like having civics courses, teaching kids how politics work, that sort of thing. And there are also some really important latent functions to schools. These are, nobody really says this is the main reason why we have a school, but while we have school, they also provide childcare. So, this is clearly important to parents. Clearly part of the problem of coronavirus for parents is the kids are all at home now, and that that makes life difficult, especially for parents of like elementary age kids. If they want to go to work, they have to work out alternate arrangements. We also point out that being in school delays people's entrance to the workforce. And so, if everybody was trying to get a job when they were 16, the unemployment rates would be much higher. So this is something for people to do in their adolescence that keeps them out of the workforce. Already mentioned the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That's part of symbolic interaction. Labeling theory is also part of the idea here. With tracking. We tell some kids right away, oh, you're the smart kids, you're the slow kids. The idea in labeling theory is that people tend to conform to the labels that they are ascribed. So the slow kids tend to slow down a bit, and the fast kids, the smart kids, even if they're not necessarily intrinsically smarter, will work harder. Conflict theory, again, the Marxists, point out that, schools really reproduce inequality. Rich schools and private schools especially produce better off kids. Worse schools just produce kids who are fit for the working class. Also, from a broader political perspective, conflict theorists point out the hidden curriculum in schools. Things like that the U.S. Is always the good guy. There was something to this. This kind of it came out of hiding a little bit a couple of years ago when Texas refused to use school books that talked about American imperialism. So I don't know how much of a focus you got on this in your high school education, right? But there was this period that historians tend to talk about America as an imperialist, taking over places like Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Texas didn't like that. Because that makes America maybe sound like not so much the good guy, and so a lot of our textbooks, now kind of sweep that under the rug. Feminist theory, of course, emphasizes the different kinds of education that that men and women get. Clearly, this has attenuated somewhat in the last 30, 40, 50 years, but still teaching jobs reflect gender. So I don't know if there's something like less than 1% of kindergarten teachers are men, right? So the earlier grades tend to be filled with female teachers. And as you get further towards senior year, there are more male teachers there. But also, you see more male science teachers, more female history teachers, that sort of thing, and that of course reinforces for students gender stereotypes, and then that also does go to tracking. So women are tracked into different professions, different kinds of coursework, both at the K-12 level and higher up. And again, you see a place like Eckerd is trying to go against that and trying to get more women into STEM courses, STEM professions, but looking around the nation, still those are male dominated. Politically, I've been talking off and on about political issues. Just in a real kind of macro level sense, though, there are macro differences in how people politically think we should be funding schools or schooling children in America. And the conservative side has tended to be associated in recent years with the school choice movement, although I should say there are some more liberal people who have gotten on the school choice bandwagon. The basic idea with school choice is to try to undermine the public monopoly on schooling. And the argument here is that if we made schools more like businesses, made them compete for students, then they would get better, kind of in the with basically the idea that a better product on the market will be the one that people buy. They have various ways of doing that, from charter schools that are that are available to public school students that have special curriculums that are run by private companies. So this is, the Eddyville Charter School here. It looks like it's being run out of somebody's house. Magnet schools are schools that are within the public school system, but that have special facilities or programs for things like, some down here we have like marine science and culinary arts. But I think the most controversial is probably these school vouchers, where you actually take the tax money that you would spend on students in public school, and you can give it to parents in a check that they would then take to attend private schools. The other side of the conservative picture here is that conservatives have tended to push for school accountability, pushing for things like now that the now defunct No Child Left Behind Act, which really forced schools to do lots of testing. Everybody's backing off a little bit from that now. Liberals tend to be against the school choice movement, tend to support public school funding. Partly that's tied to kind of the old school liberal alliance with labor unions. And so teachers are in teachers unions, and they don't want public schools undermined. Charter schools, private schools do not generally hire union teachers. So that's part of the reason liberals oppose school choice. Partly, though, they say, really the ultimate problem is that we just don't fund schools enough. To the extent that there are problems with schools, it's because, none of them are getting enough money. They also push for more Head Start education, and specifically to the school choice issue. They note that charter schools and private schools tend often not to spend the money on students as much as we'd like them to. So often when we have charter schools or when we send public money in school vouchers to private schools, that money ends up in the pockets of CEOs and not really in the classroom. And the most radical idea is to do things that limit the ability of localities to spend more or less on their kids, to make to raise taxes across the board and spend as much on all students across all schools. Again, I would point out, this is mostly where the debate is now. None of this tends to recognize that, again, it really is families and the home that are the most important distinction between educational outcomes. Clearly, there are movements around different educational issues. So the question of school choice is not just within political parties, but there really is a social movement here with different organizations like EdChoice or the American Federation for Children that is promoting things like vouchers and charter schools. And again, that tends to fall towards conservatives, but not exclusively. Right? So there are some liberals, especially minority parents in urban districts, in some places, really, who traditionally align themselves with liberal causes, are aligned with the school choice movement. So it's not purely conservative, but is largely conservative. More towards the center, you have groups like the Gates Foundation that tries to make schools better by throwing money at them or by trying to use innovative pedagogical methods. There's quite a large school safety movement now. Some of those have, kind of specifically come up in response to the school shootings at places like Douglas and Newtown. But that also includes groups like the AFT, is the American Federation of Teachers, the NEA is the National Education Association. Both of them, clearly want less violence in schools. And more towards the left, but I wouldn't say they're very far to the left. Teachers unions, mostly the American Federation of Teachers, push are aligned generally with the Democratic Party. Generally push for better teacher pay. Things like more freedom of teachers in how they teach, and smaller class sizes. Just I'll finally note, a lot of people's organizing, a lot of people's political involvement often begins at the local level and around schools and around particular issues. So there's a lot of local organizing about things like teacher salary, or whether to open a new school or close beloved local schools. That really gets a lot of people politically active, and sometimes in the long term. A lot of our politicians actually come out of people who are interested in schools. Okay, we are at full time for the day. I gotta get started on my next class, and you may have another class. Keep up with the homework. And again, if you have any more questions about what we talked about today or anything, don't be afraid to get in contact. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.
Thanks, Professor.
All right, take care.